Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Selena Joffrey, and I'm the Director of Business and Policy at Asia Society Texas Center. Tonight's program is on the topic of US-Japan relations, and the timing is perfect as we're hosting this on the eve of Prime Minister Suga's visit to Washington. This is his first official visit overseas as Japan's leader, and President Biden's first in-person visit with a foreign leader since he took office in January. This visit signifies the importance both countries place on the strength of the US-Japan alliance. There are many key issues that the two leaders will aim to address, such as the US commitment to engage in the Indo-Pacific region, regional security issues, and cooperation on policy towards China and North Korea, trade and economy, climate change, and many others. To hear about this, we're honored to have with us Wendy Cutler, who is the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Prior to joining Asia Society, Wendy spent almost 3 decades as a diplomat and negotiator, and also served as acting Deputy US Trade Representative. She worked on a range of bilateral, regional, and multilateral trade initiatives, including the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, US-China negotiations, and the WTO financial services negotiations. Takako Hikutani is professor of modern Japanese politics and foreign policy at Columbia University. She previously taught at the National Defense Academy of Japan. Her research focuses on civil military relations, Japanese domestic politics, and Japanese foreign policy. Our moderator is Motoko Rich, who's the Tokyo bureau chief for the New York Times, where she covers Japanese politics, society, gender and the arts, as well as news and features on the Korean Peninsula. Following the program, we'll be taking some viewer questions, so please share your questions through the YouTube comment box. We hope you enjoy the program. Over to you, Motoko.
So thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Selena. And as you point out, our timing is pretty impeccable that we are talking today just as Prime Minister Suga arrives in Washington to meet with President Biden. So we have a lot to talk about today. I'm also thrilled to point out, as will be obvious to anyone watching, that we have an all-women's panel today, which is actually rather rare when it comes to talking about Japan and Japan-related issues. So we'll definitely take advantage of that by talking about gender. But as you will see, just because someone is a woman doesn't mean we are by any means limited in our expertise to only talking about gender. I mean, the two people we have here today, Wendy and Takako, are, as you heard, experts on a range of issues. So I'm really honored to be here to moderate this conversation. So without further ado, I think we should probably just get into talking about the visit, because obviously that's current in the news, and it's a way to unpack a lot of issues. And in some ways, you would think that this could be kind of a softball visit for both leaders, kind of a way to ease into their foreign policy, as they're both relatively, I mean, President Biden is obviously very new since January, but Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga is also quite new in the job. And this is, for both of them, their first major meeting with a foreign leader. And for Japan, this is a little bit of are very grateful to be the first country invited to the White House. They were the first country to host new Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and new Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. So it sort of shows that Japan is kind of still a primary relationships for the United States. So Takako-san, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what you expect for the visit. And obviously, I think the most important thing on the agenda this time is China. And that could be an area where there's a bit of daylight between the two leaders. So what might seem like a kind of easy, let's talk about how we love the alliance and we want to continue and kind of forge ahead into the future, there could be some areas of tension regarding China and also regarding the Taiwan Strait. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Thank you very much, Motoko. It's a great pleasure to be here today. It's a great honor to take part in this event by the Asia Society. I have had great experiences with Asia Society Japan, and it's really new to me today that I get to visit Asia Society Texas. On your point, Motoko, I think we have experienced not just in terms of US-Japan relations, but sort of a more of a interestingly boring, predictable presidency compared to what we have for the last 4 years, which means that these things, these media, the Japanese like significance of this for Japan, as you mentioned, Motoko, is a really obvious diplomatic win for Japan, that Suga got to be the first in-person visitor in the White House, especially because domestic politics-wise, it's very important for the Japanese prime minister to have a strong relationship with the US president, and that having this occasion for Suga must be a very big thing for him as a prime minister. But having said that, I think what you mentioned about China and the possible, maybe not, I don't think that there will be any obvious size of disagreement through this meeting, but it's basically how things are, how the meeting sets a tone for what goes forward. And I think what the experts are watching is that they can't go softer than the language they used in March at the 2+2 meetings with regards to how they US and Japan sees the China situation, because I think that some have argued that it was the China situation, because I think that some have argued that it was almost like crossing a Rubicon, that Japan basically, that the two countries said that the Chinese behavior presents economic, military, technological challenges to the alliance and to the international community. That seems to be rather, like we hear that a lot these days in the US, but to be on the same page with the US, especially in a language that includes the word Taiwan Strait, which was included in this, was seen to be possibly a break from Japan's past that was more careful about the wordings about these issues. So I think that it wouldn't go below this, so it might go a little bit higher. It might seem a little bit committed, and what kind of repercussion Japan's going to face from China will be interesting, since China immediately criticized Japan as saying that Japan invited the wolf to enter the room after that statement came out. So that's what I would watch in terms of what the wording might be. But I think it's more about setting the tone of expectations of the deeds that is to come up by the end of the year, which will be also interesting how much they commit to doing something in the future, if not right now. So thanks.
Well, that's a very interesting, if I may ask a follow-up question, when you say that, I think you're right, that the meeting is such at a high level that we're not expecting any surprise, and that, but you talk about what follows, committing to deeds. What kind of deeds would you be looking for?
There will be, I think there's already working level discussions about having a 2+2 meeting, was it by the end of this calendar year, or I think. And so they would be talking about more what could be done in terms of defense cooperation. And I'm sure there has been discussions in the defense community about like what to do for the two forces, how the Japan self-defense forces might be able to step up in terms of what it can do within the alliance relationship, if there is a type of a contingency that we are thinking about. If that reaches something that is more concrete, and if especially, I think, although there's enough, I think there has been working level considerations. If it becomes a political statement, I think that will be something that will be a great change, and possibly have a spillover effect to the other policies that Japan might have with China, if that is going to be a much stronger language than before. But that, I think we still have to wait and see what happens. But I think at this point, how much political stake there would be in committing more to this will be something to look for, but not probably immediately in this summit itself, but what seems to be in the works going forward. I think. Interesting.
And not to mention the backlash from China, there's also potential for some unrest, or unrest is probably too strong a word, but disquiet in Japan domestically, if there's a sense that Japan is taking more assertive posture militarily. So I imagine that it would not be an easy step for the Japan side to take. Sorry, go ahead.
I think there's just there's two different types of the possible backlash or reservations about that. One is the group that worries about deterioration of relationship with China, especially for business interests, and the other is the more of, is this going to lead to like stronger military force, which there's still a lot of reservations about it within Japan.
Right. Right. Thank you. I wanted to turn to you, Wendy, to talk about trade. Obviously, under the Trump administration, Japan kind of lived in constant fear that there might be sort of a big tariff announcement, or there might be a new trade policy announced on Twitter. And things seem to be calmer here. The various discussions have been put on hold for now. But one of the big questions, and I don't know if it's likely to come up at this summit, so I'm interested in your view, is whether or not the United States might at some point reconsider joining the TPP. The people I've talked to have said that they don't think it'll come up at this summit in particular, but it's obviously a looming question in the background. It was one of the very first actions that President Trump took when he took office, was to withdraw the United States from the TPP. And then Japan obviously took leadership to kind of revive this multilateral trade agreement and make sure it was able to go into force without the United States. So I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, sure. Let me just say, I think this is going to be a really important meeting for both sides. I think for Suga, it's really his first big international trip, and it comes at a really important time in the alliance, but also with respect to our relationship in the region itself, coming on the heels not only of the 2+2 meeting, but also the recent Quad leaders meeting. And for the US, I think it's going to also be very important for us to show that, we have a solid forward-looking alliance with Japan, and Japan's going to be an important partner as we shape our regional and global policies. What I think will be interesting, I think this is one of the first summits in a long time, as far as I can remember, where I don't think trade's really going to come up. I don't think Japan is worried about trade, and I think that really contrasts with what they were concerned about with respect to the previous administration. And I don't think the US is going to be making demands on trade. That said, the CPTPP, I think, is kind of always lingering in the background. And maybe it's more general than that. Like, what is the US plan for economic and trade engagement in the region? And that's really critical, because without a solid economic and trade agenda in the region, it's really difficult for the United States to show everyone that they're back. I think there will be economic components to this summit. And when I look at the statement, I will be looking to see whether and what both sides have agreed to with respect, for example, to supply chains, and particularly with respect to semiconductors. I think that is going to be an important issue of discussion, as both countries' auto companies are really hurting from lack of access to needed semiconductors to build cars right now.
For our listeners who might not be quite as familiar with the supply chain issues, can you make more explicit what you're talking about? Is the problem that China mainly controls the production of semiconductors, and both countries are looking to diversify their supply away from China, or what is the issue with semiconductors?
There are a number of issues here, but the critical issue right now is that there's just a global shortage of semiconductors. And this has led to the shutdown of auto plants in the United States and also in other parts of the world, including Japan. And
why is there a shortage? Is that because of the pandemic?
Yeah, so part of it is there are kind of two reasons I would put forward. One is just a demand for electronics products and really demand for cars right now in the post-COVID world. And second, that many Chinese companies have been, let's just say, front-loading their purchases of semiconductors, really storing them up, in the wake of, in the face of U.S. export control restrictions on them. And so the combination of both has led to a global shortage. And this is an area where the U.S. and Japan have shared and yet complementary interest, in that Japan is really competitive with respect to the production of materials and equipment, as well as chips. And the US is very strong on the design side. And so the question will be, can they reach some kind of supply chain agreement where both sides deal with their concerns with respect to the way supply chains are not functioning well now. And they may agree to something concrete. I think what we'll see may be agreement to some general principles and then an agreement to continue working on this issue. So I think in the economic front, that might be one of the key deliverables or outcomes from this meeting at a really critical time.
What kind of principles would you be looking for them to agree to? Like what, if you were kind of in the room, what would you nudge them toward?
I think it's how they can together deal with shortages, how they can use their complementary design, production, and material and equipment capabilities to complement each other. So in other words, each side doesn't feel like they feel they can rely on the other side. This isn't just a US-Japan issue. They would have to broaden this out to make it really substantive. But I think the idea is for resilient supply chains and that allow trade and production, to continue and to really rev up during this time of shortage.
And just to bring it back quickly to the TPP, I mean, doesn't sound like it's going to come up at this meeting, but just to move it beyond the context of just this meeting, what do you think is the U.S. likely under President Biden to reconsider entering in the way that they immediately joined the Paris Agreement? Are they thinking about the TPP?
I would love to say yes, but in all fairness, I just don't see this happening anytime soon. I don't rule it out completely. But given where the United States is in terms of focusing on COVID recovery, economic recovery, and competitiveness, and let's just be honest, given the kind of toxic nature of TPP politically for the United States, I just don't see this in the cards anytime soon. But I don't think this precludes U.S. economic engagement in the region. And the U.S. needs then to be creative and figure out what is their affirmative trade and economic agenda in the region. If they can't do a big trade agreement like CPTPP, why not move in areas like developing resilient supply chains or developing a regional digital trade agreement or develop principles and agreement on climate and trade, which is another area that I think is going to be a focus of the Suga Biden meeting tomorrow, particularly in the lead up to the Earth Day summit meeting that the president will be hosting with 40 leaders next week.
Well, that was actually my very next question, and I'd love to hear from both of you.
Good transition, right?
Yes, perfect transition. Thank you for setting me up there. I would like to hear from both of you on this. This is obviously an area where, unlike the previous administration, there seems to actually be, I don't know if it was completely natural, but both sides have sort of independently been talking about wanting to set new reduction of carbon emission goals, a desire to cooperate on climate change. And so I wondered what we might see. I mean, it could be either out of the bilateral summit meeting, or as you say, there's this Earth Day summit the next week. What kind of agreements are we looking for? I mean, I've talked to people who've said that both sides might be looking to set more aggressive targets for carbon emission reduction, but that also there might be an ask on the US side, which is that the Biden administration would be keen to persuade Japan to stop financing coal plants in other countries. Japan has been active in this area, but has been gradually reducing. And of course, the biggest financier is China. So that's sort of the big prize of trying to persuade China to stop doing that. But getting Japan and I believe South Korea to stop is sort of a goal as well. So maybe we'll go to Takako and then come back to you, Wendy, to talk about climate change as an area of discussion between the two countries.
Right. I think there, as Japan tried to look into what the Biden administration is going to be focusing on and how they might be different from the previous administration, they're obviously aware that the two issues are climate change and probably values and human rights and democracy. And that I think that is very much, you see the awareness. And there was an article, that opinion piece by Prime Minister Suga this morning in the Wall Street Journal. And that's what he includes a lot of things about climate change as a driving force to create strong, sustainable growth. and that Japan can be a leader. But in terms of what exactly, I think the things that you just mentioned are the things that we hear concretely. And otherwise, I'm not too sure if there is that much of, aside from Japan's announcing carbon neutral by 2050, I think they are still in the negotiation stage with the US about what they can do together with the US, although it is a high agenda for Japan and there's a strong awareness. And I think the other thing about the climate change that I think it was hard to make a connection within the security establishment from the people who do security about how much it's a security issue. And I think it didn't really click for a very long time within Japan about how it seemed like the US is willing to compromise on climate, on security issues vis-a-vis China, because China is such a big player, or like you have to have China to be part of the system. This sort of goes against the security concerns in Japan. The US focusing on climate change means softer on China because they have to bring them in, and it's kind of bad for security, tend to be the type of framing that people tend to have. And I think that finally, that's not really the case anymore, not just because of the focus by the Biden administration, but if you think about it, Japan is basically going through disasters. You must experience this, and you're covering in Japan for the past 5 years. It's like one of the highest ranking countries, which has to do with, it's not really clear how the connection goes, but they are very prone to national disasters. So there's some kind of a world that Japan can play in terms of what to do in the response, but there's an obvious interest in what to do about the fact that climate change does affect people's security of a region. And that's one of the things that the Self-Defense Force is known for anyway. So I think there's a better connection between how it's actually a security issue. It's not something that goes against the security issue. And I think that's the change that I see over the past year.
That's fascinating. Wendy, I wonder if you could talk about, on the economic side, what areas of cooperation might there be between the two countries to deal with climate change? I mean, do you think that they could have a kind of vibrant cooperation on developing renewables or technology exchange? I mean, do you see that actually happening? I mean, people talk about that a lot, and then I see that those words, but I wonder what kind of action we might anticipate.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what we're seeing in Washington is really an all hands on deck, all agencies on deck in terms of working on climate change. And so I think what our Japanese counterparts will see in various ministries over the next 4 years is a lot of discussions about what they can do with respect to their area on climate change. I think, as Takako mentioned, both the US and Japan have agreed to be carbon neutral by 2050, but for the United States, over the upcoming summit, as well as looking to COP, they are going to be pressing other countries to announce what they're unilaterally going to do to meet those targets, earlier by 2030. I hear that year out there. And so you may see announcements by the United States in the coming days of what we plan to do. And then based on that, working with other countries to get them to pony up as well. And as we speak now, whilst Prime Minister Suga is in Washington, former Secretary Kerry is in China, he will also be going to Korea in advance of the summit next week. And I think that also shows kind of all hands on deck, working with all countries. With respect to Japan and cooperation, I think you really put your finger on where I think cooperation is most likely, and that is in the area of developing green technologies, and working on standards for these technologies, and then working together to disseminate them around the world as well.
Of course, the elephant in the room for Japan is nuclear. Until 2011, nuclear was a huge part of Japan's energy supply, and it is a green energy supply, but the restart looks nowhere closer than it did a few years after the great East Japan earthquake and tsunami and nuclear disaster. And it is a country with sort of terrain problems in terms of renewable energy. It's not realistic that they could generate all of their energy needs by covering the entire island, island chain with solar panels. I mean, I've heard really interesting proposals, like we can build solar panels above rice fields and sort of grow the rice, but also, have the solar energy generated. But there are all kinds of problems, even like with the sort of particularities of the region in terms of geography, in terms of how they could develop a vibrant renewable sector. I don't know if this is an area that the US would be involved in, or if either of you are familiar enough with nuclear policy, but do you think that that's something that will come up between the two countries, or is that really just a problem for Japan to solve?
Do you think it will come up in a bilateral sense, Wendy? Because I think it's basically, as you said, Motoko, it is the elephant in the room. And you kind of wonder how you can achieve what the goal is without restarting. But then the sentiment is quite strong. And I wasn't in Japan in March 2011, and actually didn't experience what happened there myself there. But I can see, since we were going through a lot of 10-year reflections of what happened, that you kind of understand why there are strong resistance after sort of going through that once again. So I don't know, it is, I'm not too sure if this is a bilateral thing. I thought back in 2011, since some plants in the US, that are used in Japan are the similar ones that is used in the US, that there might be some ripple effect about the dangers of nuclear power plants in general. I actually looked that up because I was interested in whether the same plant, if there was any local resistance or reconsideration within the US, but I didn't really see that. So other than that, I think even in the recollections of what happened to 11, it's just that I don't really see something that is bilateral, that in terms of overcoming or restarting, but maybe I'm missing something. So is there something that is bilateral in nature, Wendy, or that I just don't know?
I don't really have anything to add there. It's possible that Prime Minister Suga will explain to the president, if asked, what describe the challenges he faces in this area. But I think overall, the discussions on climate will go well. I think, again, we have shared interests, and I think Japan understands that this is such an important objective for the Biden administration, and will want to help the Biden administration achieve, the global objective that it's pressing for internationally.
Right. I guess one thing to know, which I thought was interesting, is just 2 days ago, I think Japan, or a couple of days ago, Japan had to release the water from Fukushima Daiichi,
which is hugely controversial, not just in Japan, but
China had some strong words.
Right.
Yes, China, South Korea, Taiwan.
All has strong words, but I thought it was interesting when I was looking at the Twitter of Antony Blinken, that he actually tweeted about how he supports the transparent nature of Japan's decision to release this. And it was like a standalone statement just on that. And that I thought was quite interesting, because it's not something that he needed to pick up on. Other than
that was probably a negotiated statement, would be my guess, right?
Yes, but it's interesting that it came out at that timing, that it sort of, that was not going to be a concern expressed by the US, and there was an appreciation to the transparent nature of the process. And I think the wording was very carefully crafted, that there must have been something to that going out prior to this. Yeah.
But I think this also underscores like the contrast with the previous administration, and how much preparation is underway for the summit meeting, how much contact there have been between officials leading up to this meeting. And maybe by putting out that statement means that this issue will not be on the agenda for the bilateral leaders meeting.
Yeah.
Right. Another topic that a lot of folks have mentioned as being a potential area of discussion is infrastructure cooperation in the region. Japan has tried to position itself as the kind of purveyor of kind of the quality infrastructure projects in the region, kind of positioning itself as opposed to China, which has much more money and muscle, and that Japan can never compete on that front, but that they will, their promise is that we will A, build quality projects, B, we won't leave countries with huge amounts of debt. And that's sort of the positioning. And I've heard that there is interest within the Biden administration to kind of cooperate with Japan on those kinds of initiatives in helping to build infrastructure in the ASEAN area, Africa, and other areas where Japan, the US, Japan, and also India and Australia, members of the so-called Quad, might be trying to create a kind of bulwark against Chinese influence. Perhaps we'll start with Wendy to talk talk about where you think that kind of cooperation might go, or if that's an important issue for the bilateral alliance?
I think, that is an issue that will be on the agenda. I don't expect a lot of conversation about it, but I expect that there will be a few sentences or a couple of sentences in the joint statement because we have shared objectives there. And this is an area that the Quad is focused on.
Yeah, I agree. And it's something that had already started, like one of the somewhat a continuity from the previous administration. But if you add the word infrastructure, it goes along with the Biden administration's Build Back Better. And that I think that, and it also, since the Quad meeting was interesting because they didn't mention China in word, but it was basically about that. And also it was not as security focused as it was in previous times. So I think just taking off from what was in the Quad statement, I can see more bilateral initiatives coming out. And I can't really think of what exactly in terms of the infrastructure project, but just make it easy, not make it harder for China to be the dominant force in the region, and offering an alternative to the countries in the region is something that the two countries have in common as an obvious goal. And I think infrastructure and these kinds of developmental issues in the region is going to be important going forward. So I wouldn't be surprised if, as Wendy said, there's a line or two that talks about that in the joint statement, but I don't really know what exactly.
I will say another issue that I think will come up and was really a focus of the recent Quad leaders meeting is cooperation on kind of COVID recovery and vaccine dissemination and production. And one of the key outcomes and really the positive agenda of the Quad was the vaccine announcement that was made between the four countries, and really pooling together the expertise of Japan, Australia, India, and the United States to promise billions of vaccines to other parts of Asia and the world. I know that there's a few complications now given what's going on in India now, and the fact that COVID is spreading very quickly there, and they've put export restrictions on vaccines. But hopefully they'll find their way through this. But, I would just underscore, whether it be infrastructure or vaccine development or climate change, that the Quad, for which the United States and Japan are really, leading this effort, will be an important topic of discussion. And I suspect that the US and Japan, through the joint statement, will talk about with a little more granularity about how the Quad will move forward, particularly with respect to the working groups they set up on technology, climate, and vaccines.
Sorry, sorry that I lost connection. Can people
hear me? We were a little nervous.
I'm back. So the other elephant in the room, of course, is the Olympics. And we've been getting, actually, just in the last few days, some mixed signals from the Japanese government. The number two in the ruling party said that it's possible that they could be canceled, although he used that very sort of Japanese elocution about how if it is impossible to hold, it will be impossible to hold. But cancellation is not out of the realm of possibility, whereas the organizing committee has been very sort of, the train is on the track, has left the station and going ahead. But do you think this might come up in some way about, concerns about the fact that the pandemic is not yet under control? Japan itself has vaccinated less than 1% of its own population, is not on track to have them fully vaccinated in time for the Olympics. Do you think this might be a topic of conversation between the two leaders, or is that just something completely out of the realm of the bilateral relationship?
I suspect the Prime Minister will extend an invitation to the President to attend the Olympics.
Correct. Yes.
I don't know. It's interesting because I remember I was watching the press conferences pretty almost like every day for a while when the Biden administration started. And pretty early on, there was a question to Jen Psaki to what is the US position on the Olympics. And I know that there was an interest in what the Biden administration is thinking about, but it's one of those things that it's really hard for the Biden administration, I think, to say something that's going to affect the decision. And that they can't say they want the Olympics to happen, or what exactly could be included, I think is tricky at this point. And I think the response by Jen Psaki was, I'm a really big sports fan. I hope that it will be like, it might happen, but it's not something that as a government official, I have anything to say. And I think that's the tricky thing about this, even in the summit meeting. I'd be curious to know if there's like a nice diplomatic, nice thing that is said in reference to the Olympics, like we hope it happens or something like that.
But well, actually, I think in the recent G7 leader statement, there was kind of, a line about the G7 countries welcoming, the Tokyo Olympics, something along those lines. So.
Well, I think that was seen here as a diplomatic victory, but I did talk to some, American officials who said behind the scenes that, like, look at the actual language. We didn't actually endorse it, or there's always a backdoor out for everybody. In the time we have left before we open to questions, I did want to talk about women in Japan. Obviously, this was such a huge priority rhetorically for the previous prime minister in Japan. He had the Womenomics initiative, and he repeatedly would go out on the world stage at places like the World Economic Forum and boast about the fact that Japan had, in fact, a higher labor force participation rate among women than even the United States. That was one of his favorite talking points. He never mentioned in those talking points that the majority of those women were in part-time or contract jobs without benefits or a chance of advancement. And he also didn't talk about the fact that the administration set goals for political participation in his own party and leadership management that the administration had to explicitly ratchet back the goals themselves, and then didn't even meet the goals, the ratcheted back goals. Suga has sort of said, Prime Minister Suga has said that, he's also interested in supporting women. He's mentioned a few other initiatives like support for couples that are struggling with fertility, setting up a new child agency, which, because of the burdens of childcare tending to fall on women, seems to be more of a women supportive initiative, but wondered what your thoughts were, and this is more a specific Japan question, on whether or not, in light of the toppling of Yoshiro Mori as the president of the Olympic Committee for a sexist remark, whether things are actually starting to change in Japan, and what you might expect from the current administration. So maybe Takako, you could start, please.
Yeah, so I think the Yoshiro Mori statement was a wake-up call in a way for those like myself, who I think in general went through it's been about 30 years since I graduated from college, and that I really didn't think about, I was aware of the gender issue, I thought it was a problem, but I really didn't think about what exactly can I do in changing the situation, given what I do. I was only thinking in the immediate, what I can do to my students when I was teaching at the academy, and how to inspire them and all that. But I think it was a real wake-up call, because I thought maybe I was one of those people that doesn't speak up in the room, and that I was maybe being kind of complacent, that I was trying not to, like the way that I was compromising what I'm doing, that there was other things I could have done to change the situation for others. That in a way, since I was reading the雰囲気 or the air in the room, like maybe I was being one of those very, like there was a phrase that's going around saying wakimaeta onna, like people who know how to behave in the room. And I thought maybe I was the woman who was knew how to behave in the room, and I was really not helping others. And I think it was just not me, but other people too, that maybe we were lucky enough maybe to depend on our parents to help us with childcare. And that we didn't really go through what others people, that we read your articles, but maybe there was more that rather than not just thinking, gosh, it's still hard for other people, but just the statement and the shock that came through made us think, what else can we do to actually step up, and not to just think that it's behind us in a way. My son is already 24, so he's kind of behind me, but what could we do? And whether or not we were complicit. It made things harder for the next generation, because we were trying to adjust in a way. And the system that we were trying to adjust was so unfair. And we were not that cognizant of that before the Mori statement. So for me, and there was a lot of discussion around people my generation after that maybe there were other things that we could have done, and that we weren't trying.
What do you think those things might have been?
To speak up when we, like maybe, for instance, if, like, just for instance, this is getting really personal, but when my son was sick, I wouldn't say that my son was sick. I would say something else to not, And maybe I should have just said, rather than just calling my mom, that maybe there's something I could have said to my workplace or to, so it's just some things that maybe I was just trying to deal with it myself and not to ruffle feathers. And that might have been not helpful to the next generation. And maybe it was something that I should have been more aware of. So that's just like a very personal example, but also in other ways too. I think there's some things that I should have been more offended by, for instance, and maybe I should have said something.
But I think, I mean, maybe Wendy, you could speak to this coming from an American perspective. I mean, it's interesting that you're talking about your own complicity and what you personally could have done, but it seems like they're certainly looking at Japan. There are so many systemic issues that it's a lot to ask of each individual woman to be the one to have to step up to change a system that's so oppressive, and not to ask of the system to help support women in situations that you're talking about. I mean, you could have spoken up, and maybe that might have created a culture in which women coming behind you would have felt more comfortable about that, but that may have put your own career at a lot of risk. That's a lot to ask of you. I wonder, Wendy, if you have some thoughts about.
Well, it's interesting because, when I think of the Mori statement, for me, that was like a wake-up call in that, like, the more things change, the more they are the same. And for a society where someone at his, it's not unusual in Japan when someone makes a mistake, they step down and they apologize quickly. And
he tried not to.
Well, exactly. Right. And how, it was day after day, right? Like this went on for a week before it was unbearable. And for me, it was like, are you kidding me? This is a society where like this type of stuff doesn't keep going on. And then they were going to replace him with another kind of old dude.
Octogenarian, who was his right-hand man.
Exactly. Now that didn't come to fruition. And then they found Hashimoto-san and she took over. But I just think that it just shows that, it's one step forward, two steps back. But I think it also just shows that there's so much the government, can do in this sphere, right? They can try and make things easier with childcare. They can, say the right things. They can set targets. But when it comes down to it, it has to be complemented by a real, shift in culture and just a change in the mindset. And hopefully that will happen, with the new generation. And Takako's son, who's 24, hopefully he's been trained very well to listen to women and appreciate them speaking in meetings. Part of me thinks like, just one more thing on, when I look at Japan and one of the areas, they set these soft targets, right? By 2020, that 30% of senior people and corporations and the government would be female. And I think the diet now is at like 10%. It's lower than any other, if I'm correct, G7 or OECD country. And I'm wondering if Japan just needs to kind of bite the bullet and actually set hard targets in these areas. Maybe that's just a way to kind of shake things up a bit. But it's been really slow moving, and Abe, he put a lot of priority on this. And frankly, as you mentioned, Mitoko, there are more women in the workforce, but they're temporary workers. They're irregular workers. They were the ones who were hurt the most when COVID,
absolutely,
hit it. When COVID hit, many women were in the services sector. They had childcare problems, elder care responsibilities, and it hit women all over the world, but I think in Japan, maybe the hit was even sharper.
We want to switch to audience questions, but I just quickly wanted to ask Takako-san, given that you do have a 24-year-old son, and one of the things that was actually kind of inspiring about covering Mori-san's resignation was the fact that part of it was prompted by a petition that was put together by young women of your son's generation. There was and your alma mater, Keio student, was one of the leaders of that initiative. And so it does seem like there is a change among the young generation. I mean, it's difficult for them because demographically they're far outnumbered by the over 65s. But I wonder if you see any changes in that generation.
Right. So I've been away from my family. My husband and my son's in Japan. They're self-sufficient. And I think that's normal. I don't think it's normal that the mom disappears when he turns 18, but it wasn't really a controversial thing because they're self-sufficient. And I think they see change. And they're more sons have mothers who work. And I think that's, so they don't assume that their wives would stay at home to take care of them, I don't think. And so I think that's one thing. And I think my son was more sympathetic to me than my husband in a way, that I was basically taking care of him or his grandmother. So I think he grew up being aware of that being an issue if he expects his future spouse to be working in a way, saying that he wants, and maybe not just because of idealism, but because of the economic need. That might be preferable. But as I said, yeah, and I think it's good that it's the petition. I think, from my understanding, it's not just coming from the women, but it's more of a generational issue. That I think that it's more not just a woman issue, but also there's men that think that they want to change their lifestyle. So that's kind of going together with the gender issue. I think that's very important. And also, I do think that it shouldn't be just a personal awakening, but I think there's a sense that maybe we prolong the system by being personally part of the system. And that I think the awakening in our generation might actually trigger some change too, because I think the horrible, like the everlasting Mori debacle basically, and how bad it was just made like sort of put us feeling really guilty about maybe we're part of the system. And I think there might be some things coming, not just from the younger generation who want change, but from our generation, because one change that I saw is that when I was in college, I think there was much less women in college, not necessarily in KO, but in general. I looked at the data. The women graduating from four-year college was just above 10% or so, when the men was more than 50%. Now there's more women who graduate from four-year college than men. And there's something wrong when the leadership structure is not really up to
reflecting
that. That's just, there's something wrong about what happened in the past 30 years that needs to be changed. And I think there is like a lot of awakening sort of across generations, but also the younger generation, as I mentioned. And I hope, although we do have basically a reverse shaped pyramid going on, I do think that there might be some movement for change. And maybe that might be the silver lining of the whole Mori thing. That was, I think, an international embarrassment, but still, maybe there might be some shock factor that might bring out good things, including the possibility of what you said, Wendy, about the quota system in the diet. I think maybe something like that is necessary.
If I could just add to what, just one point.
Actually, you know what? I think we should give our people online, because we only have a few minutes, opportunity to ask some questions. So let me just switch to that. Maybe some of them are asking follow-up questions that will lead to next points. Let's see. Here's one. So Sam asks, Japan is facing a serious population issue with probably the lowest fertility rates in the world and an aging population. How is Japan planning for this, as this will cause significant economic issues in the near future? So that's sort of dovetailing a little bit with what we're talking about. Wendy, you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways they're planning for it is to try and get women in the workforce, right? Because they need more people working as people, get older, they need more support, and you'll have more people needing support than actually working. So that's key. They're also trying to take measures to increase fertility and the willingness of women to get married earlier and have more children. I don't know how much success they're having, because I don't.
But what do you make of the actual efforts they're making? I mean, are they realistic efforts, or are they more just like cheerleading, like go out and have babies?
I don't know. I haven't seen the data, but it doesn't suggest to me that they're having, tremendous success. I think what's happening is that women are looking at the lifestyle of their mothers and they want to enjoy life. They're getting married later. And I don't think this is just happening in Japan. This is elsewhere in Asia and in the United States as well. But I do think Japan, it does face a real demographic challenge. Either there seem to me to be two solutions with respect to the workforce: either integrate women more fully into the workforce, not just in temporary jobs, and open the doors to more immigration. And, that's very controversial as well.
Takako-san, I think you hinted at something when you were talking about this question that is not just about women, but it's a generational issue. And I wonder in the context of this question about increasing fertility, and to Wendy's point about people sort of looking at the work culture and saying, I don't want that. Can you talk a little bit about whether men might also be part of that?
Part of
the sort of protest against the work culture, that part of the reason why marriage rates are declining and fertility rates are declining are, on the one hand, that there are fewer of these job for life. But on the other hand, the only people who feel confident about starting families are the people who have these jobs for life. But these jobs for life require, take every blood from their stones that they have to give. They have to work late and all weekend, and that's not conducive to family life either. It's sort of this sort of weird vicious cycle, it seems like.
Right. I think in terms of the population decline issue, the whole agenda, the Abenomics was women and having older people work and maybe robots and somewhat of immigration, but not much more. So the combination of the four. But on your question, I think maybe if there is a silver lining to COVID this time, that people realize that they spend more time with family, I think, from what I hear in this past year. And there's some kind of a work style change that when men don't hang out in restaurants and drink after work. Because I remember I would be in Tokyo with my Columbia colleague and he'll ask me, why aren't these guys going home? And an extension of work thing that they are drinking somewhere. And so I think if there was a force stopped to a certain extent, I hear about this, then there might be realization that they might want to spend some time at home, or they might realize how much the wives are taking on and how much work it is to have childcare, and they might prefer to actually do more, as there might be more of a preference to do more, and that might change things. But I think overall, the workforce issue, I think, is not like a women issue. I think it's actually more both women and men in terms of how they are supposed to work, how they're supposed to raise family at the same time. And that like just the government paying for the fertility treatment is not like, that's great, but I don't think that's the solution. I think there has to be more realization that both parents have to spend more time at home. And that I think maybe might be something that might come out of this COVID, that people might have spent some time with family, and that might change people's mind a bit, but I don't know, because you might know.
I think it could go both ways. I've heard both that, people are enjoying their time at home, and also that for women it has been more of a burden because now they have another person to take care of at home. It depends on the family, I think. Let's go back to some questions here. So this might be for Wendy or either of you. What are some things that the U.S. really needs to do to demonstrate that it is committed to Japan? This is from Selena. This is Pranav. This is obviously a concern from Japan, repeatedly looking for reassurances from the U.S. But what are some things that the U.S. really needs to do to demonstrate that? Whoever wants to take that.
Well, clearly to reaffirm our commitment to the alliance, that needs to happen all the time. And I think that's welcomed by Japan. And again, I think the multifaceted engagement in the Indo-Pacific region, and Japan knows that it has a partner in the region as it seeks to, promote similar values and principles in the region. I think those are two key areas that Japan's looking for.
Takako, do you have some thoughts?
In terms of saying the right things, I don't think there's much more that the Biden administration can do in terms of reassurance. And that other than that, I think in terms of action, there was a lot of support or increased support after the 3/11 incident in the US. For me, being part of the defense establishment, I didn't think it was that surprising that the US did what it did in support of the disaster relief after the tsunami. But it seemed to have been surprising to a lot of Japanese people who was supporting the US alliance as an option or something that they didn't see. But seeing the US forces come when the Japan needed help was something that made people support it. So the approval rating or the support for the alliance, which was already high, but really high after 3/11. And it's not that we don't want another disaster to see that happen, but I just think that right now, in terms of what is needed, I don't really think that you need that much more of words. And there's something to be said that despite the words by President Trump, that the support for the alliance hasn't really gone down much, which I thought was interesting. Part of it is Japan doesn't have another alternative, like attractive choice. But I think right now it's not, you might be surprised that the reassurance from the US was not as much of a factor as you think, even after the kind of things that President Trump said during the past administration. So I think that's
I do wonder, though, that even though President Trump made it very explicit, Japan needs to pay more for its own defense, whether or not the Biden administration might, in the end, also be making that kind of ask when they come to, after they finish their defense posture review and they start really talking about the host nation support in those negotiations, whether Japan might find that even with President Biden, that issue will come up.
I think that's definitely the case. I think there's going to be more concrete asks in terms of what Japan can do than just Japan shouldn't just be like, they should pay more. That's actually kind of an easier thing to deal with in some ways than to actually go through what Japan should be doing in case of a contingency, or to actually pay more, not just for hosting bases, but maybe its own budget. So I can see that might be coming. And that, yeah.
But to do that, it will be done more privately than kind of in a public bullying type of
Not on
approach.
Twitter?
Not on Twitter.
Exactly.
Right. I think we have time for one more question. This is from Paul. How realistic is a new Green Deal that would be led by both Japan and the United States? Either of you have thoughts on that?
I have to ask Wendy too.
I just don't see the US and Japan leading that and that being credible. I think it'd be a new Green Deal that would need to bring in the large emitters and, the other large countries to be really credible. That doesn't mean that a US-Japan partnership can't help move things forward. But in terms of being the two leading countries here, I think you really need to involve others as well to make it credible and meaningful.
So unfortunately, we do have some more questions, but we've kind of run out of time here, and wanted to thank everybody for their participation. And we have no way of knowing how many people are listening. So to all the people who have been spending their evening or morning with us, we're really grateful for that, because we know there are so many competing options and that Zoom fatigue is real. And according to my own reporting by my own colleagues, it's particularly real for women. So the fact that whoever's joined, we really appreciate it of all genders. But especially to our panelists, Wendy and Takako, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and for sharing your insights and your expertise. And we really appreciate you taking the time to do that. And it was a really great and thoughtful conversation. And obviously, as evidenced by, I'm sorry to those who have questions that we weren't able to get to, that we could have talked so much more. And I just wanted to point out that the Asia Society has another program coming on Thursday, May 6th, that might interest you. It's a conversation on racism in the time of COVID. It's with CNN reporter Amara Walker, Georgia State Representative B. Nguyen, Stop AAPI Hate co-founder Dr. Russell Jung, and Compassion in Oakland co-founder Katrina Ramos. So if you're interested in those programs, you can learn about them and all other upcoming Asia Society panels on the Asia Society website. So thank you so much for joining us. And then we do have 2 minutes left. So I wanted to ask either Takako or Wendy if you had any closing thoughts either on the summit or anything else that you'll be looking for in this upcoming year in Japan-US relations. So a minute each. Let's start with Wendy.
I think it's a big day tomorrow. I'll be reading the joint statement closely, and we'll be looking for kind of the forward work program for the two countries, not just what they agree to tomorrow, but how they chart a path forward together, because any alliance needs to grow and to modernize in order to be durable.
And Takako-san?
I don't have much to add. I look forward to the same thing, what comes out of it. And I would love to see a nice picture of the two together in front of the House. Hopefully with, I'm sorry, I went dark, Champ and Major. But anyway, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Motoko.
Thank you to everybody and to all the topics we weren't able to get to. Hopefully we can do it again sometime. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.